Dr. Deming always used to say, we'll return promptly from lunch at 1 o'clock, which means 1:05. And depending on what sort of a watch you're wearing, it's about 10:35, so I guess we're on time. At any rate, welcome back. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to draw your attention to the green sheets. I don't know if you've gone through your materials yet. I believe they're in an envelope. They ask you questions about your thoughts on the conference. Yeah, there's somebody. I see a man with a green sheet. He's turning it back. Maybe he'll know I'm identifying him. Anybody's got a green sheet? Could they wave it in the air just so everyone can see? Ah, there we go. Great. Green sheets. Last year, what OQPF did was to hand these out to you on the last day, at the last minute, and ask for your feedback. That's pretty tough if you're trying to get out the door to catch an airplane. So what we were hoping you would do this year is, if we made you aware of these green sheets, that you would, as you go along, just take some notes for us. What you like, what you'd like to see improved, what you think was terrific, what you want to hear more of, what's missing, all of that good informational feedback. So I wanted to point those out to you. This way, the conference team, as they begin planning next year's session, which they actually start doing on Tuesday and Wednesday night, will be able to have some immediate reference for improvement. Okay, I need to put my glasses on for this one. Our next speaker, Dr. John T. Edelman, is professor of philosophy at Nazareth College of Rochester in Rochester, New York, and the author of An Audience for Moral Philosophy, ? Published in London by the Macmillan Company and in New York by St. Martin's Press. Now, having gotten this far, there may be some of you in the audience thinking, oh, great. And there may be some of you in the audience thinking, oh my God, how did I get myself into this one? By his own admission, and before I read that sentence, I should say that this is the last part of Dr. Edelman's official biography that I will read to you. The rest is in your proceedings binder. Because by his own admission, John is still surprised that such a course of study as moral philosophy and such a course of study as the theory of knowledge as he's pursued over the years would have led him to the role he has played today in such companies as Eastman Kodak, General Motors, and DuPont. At GM, for example, he has led groups from all levels of the company through day-long discussions of philosophy and logic, designed to help people see the relationship between knowledge, pride of workmanship, and quality. His work with his business clients has led to a significant reduction in their sense of frustration and hopelessness with regard to such practical problems as finance, because he has found a way to assist them in seeing the connections between what's probable, what we can predict, and what that might say about our future. Last year, some of you may have spent some time with me in a concurrent session designed to start us thinking about how the assumptions we hold without question can lead us astray. And Dr. Nolan said this morning in his talk that this idea of finding out what assumptions we're operating from is very important. So to take this preliminary investigation, this idea of looking at our assumptions, a giant leap forward, I give you Dr. Edelman, who will today share with us some sense of what he has learned and how it can be applied to your day-to-day operations. Join me in welcoming Dr. John Edelman.
See if I have some better luck than Tom had with this. Yes? All right. I'm a chalk and slate kind of guy, so this is pretty high-tech for me. Thank you, Barbara. And good morning. Taking a cue from some of that introduction, I could begin by saying that it is indeed a great puzzle to be here. A pleasure, but a puzzle. What, after all, is a philosopher doing speaking to an audience of this sort? I confess openly I am a philosopher. and a teacher of philosophy. What a fate, eh? I mean, imagine yourself at a party or on the sidelines of one of your children's soccer games, and some innocent man walks up saying, well, what do you do to make a living? Oh, I'm a philosopher, right? It is that funny, isn't it? There you are, right? As my wife has often said, it's a great conversation stopper. But nonetheless, humor aside, there is, I think, something unfortunate about that state of affairs. After all, C.I. Lewis noted at the beginning of his Mind and the World Order, a bit of light reading you may have tried at some time or other. He said, philosophy is everybody's business. The central questions of philosophy, questions about what is right or good in our conduct, or questions about what is valid in our reasoning, or what is real in the world around us. These are questions that have some bearing on the day-to-day living of each and every one of us. Indeed, none of us lives without some convictions regarding what is right or good, or what is valid or invalid, or what is real or unreal. Right? So that it might be said, not only is philosophy everybody's business, but at some level everybody is a philosopher. It seems natural to many of us to puzzle over our own lives, the way we live our lives, the sense we make of the world we live in, the work we do, the people we do that work with. Right? And it wouldn't be a bad observation at all to say that the essence of philosophy just is an effort to make sense of such things. Now, that wouldn't be a bad start, right? But we have to be careful. It might also be said that it's natural to many of us to want to be healthy and to try to make ourselves healthy, but that doesn't make any of us a doctor, right? So that while it may be natural to many of us to wonder about certain philosophical matters and to try to make sense of things, success here is going to depend, I think, on something more than desire. It will depend also, I think, on the mastery of a method, and with the method, a mastery of a certain vocabulary, a way of thinking and a way of speaking. Or at least that's what I'll try to demonstrate, or that's part of what I'd like to demonstrate this morning. Right? My ultimate point will be to suggest that the mastery of this philosophical method and philosophical vocabulary will have significant practical benefits for those working in business, in industry, in healthcare, in government, in education. But actually, those practical benefits should hardly be surprising, right, if, as I've already suggested, philosophy is an effort to make sense of things. It should hardly be surprising that there are practical benefits to making sense of one's life, one's work, or the world in which one works. Now, this morning I'm going to limit myself to some of the practical benefits that follow from what philosophers call the theory of knowledge. That is, the practical benefits of a philosophical understanding of our knowledge of the world in which we live. All of the essential arguments, all the essential elements of my argument this morning are to be found in the text you've received in the conference binder. But I'd like to ask you, in large part, to set that aside for the next hour or so. You might want to take some notes as I proceed, but given the kind of material I want to cover, and the fact that you do have in the binder a quite complete set of notes already in hand, I think the best approach here is simply to try to think through with me the ideas I'm going to present with you. I'll use a few overheads, mainly to keep us straight about some terminology. But if we think through this material together over the next hour or so, and that's about what I'll take, about an hour, maybe a little bit more than that, and then I'd be happy to take questions. If we think through this material over the next hour or so, then I think you will be able in the future to turn to the notes in the binder more profitably for review or reminders or whatever. So, to begin, essentially, what I shall argue today is this, regarding some of the practical benefits of an understanding of the theory of knowledge. I'm going to argue that the branch of philosophy known as the theory of knowledge can help us to develop more appropriate expectations about the future, including more appropriate expectations about our own and others' job performance, right, in the future. Or put a little differently, I'm going to argue, as here, right, that the failure to recognize the limits of human knowledge leads to inappropriate action and policy, which are in their turn both wasteful and destructive. And why do I say wasteful? Because financial and human resources will be misspent as a result of these inappropriate expectations. Right? And this will in turn be destructive because individuals will be made to feel responsible for tasks for which they are ill-prepared, and they will be held accountable for outcomes over which they can have no significant control. My guess is that some of you out there have some experience of this. Okay? Now, for people who are not especially concerned about the kind of discouragement, anger, frustration, and alienation that come from these inappropriate expectations about the future and inappropriate planning, for people who aren't particularly concerned about all that, there's also the fact, mentioned here, a further consequence. Frustration and alienation among human beings eventually cost institutions money, which may move some people. Right? So that's the basic direction I'm going in. Right? As I say, I'm concerned with the theory of knowledge, a particular branch of philosophy. And that branch of philosophy is devoted to a certain set of questions. Right? These sorts of questions. Right? Questions about the nature of knowledge. That is, say, questions about what it is to know as distinct from believe, right? Or what it is to know as distinct from to have an opinion. Right? Secondly, questions about the kinds of knowledge available to human beings. And some of this terminology will be familiar. Empirical knowledge, a priori knowledge, what philosophers sometimes call demonstrative knowledge, what has been called dialectical knowledge, right? These different sorts that might be available to us. Right? Or third, there's a whole set of questions that philosophers concern themselves with regarding the limits of human knowledge. Right? As I ask here, can we as human beings possess knowledge of the true nature of things? The things around us, including the human beings around us. Can we possess knowledge of anything that transcends our immediate material universe? Can we have knowledge of ethical or moral matters? Or is everything in those departments a matter of opinion? These are some of the questions that exercise philosophers concerned with the theory of knowledge. But admittedly, they're somewhat odd sorts of questions. Right? And if we're to understand the theory of knowledge and what we really can learn for it, we have to understand how different these questions are from questions in, say, biology or sociology or psychology. That is, we have to get clear about the difference between, say, a sociological or psychological study of human knowledge and a philosophical study of human knowledge. Now, here the key will be to understand the difference between what I shall call philosophical issues or questions and what, on the other hand, I'll call empirical issues or questions. So, before we go any further, let me try to clarify that contrast. Right? By empirical issues or questions, or perhaps better, by empirical inquiry, right, I shall mean this. Inquiry that proceeds by and aims at the description and explanation of observable phenomena. Right? Empirical inquiry, as I'm using the expression, proceeds by observation and experiment. Okay? So, it's an empirical question, just how people come to know what they know, or just how, for instance, social contexts influence human knowing. But it's a very different sort of question to ask, what is knowledge? Now, no psychologist can take up a study of human knowing without some idea of what human knowledge is. That is, without some idea as to what is to count as human knowing. And yet there's no experiment or observation that can tell us what knowledge is. Right? The difficulty here is the question, what is knowledge? That's a question about what is to count as knowledge. It's a question about how we are to classify whatever it is that we might observe in our empirical inquiries. Right? Now, the crucial point here, I think, for us, is that any empirical inquiry must be conducted on the basis of ideas or assumptions, what some philosophers have called first principles, that are not so much the products as the presuppositions of that empirical inquiry. Right? To become aware of those first principles, those presuppositions, right, or assumptions, right? And to achieve some clarity about them, right? Their consistency, their coherence, or their inconsistency and incoherence. Right? This is part of the work of philosophy. It's part of that effort to make sense of things. And part of what I should like us to notice is that this philosophical project is a project fundamental to any sort of empirical inquiry. Again, no sociologist or psychologist or chemist can study human knowledge without some idea of what is to count as human knowing. And it's a philosophical question to ask whether that idea that the chemist or sociologist is working with is coherent. Now, this, of course, is very abstract. Right? And my task this morning is to suggest how such abstractions are of pressing practical importance to you. Right? You unbelieving people, you. Right? Well, given our common concern with the thought and work of Dr. Deming, I will take some of his remarks on the theory of knowledge as my starting point in trying to connect these abstractions to your own practical work. Right? So, as a starting point, Dr. Deming frequently remarked that the theory of knowledge teaches that management in any form is prediction. Now, part of the point here is that we plan and we act on the basis of what we think we know, right? Because a claim to know something at this present moment involves an element of prediction as to what will happen in the future. As you know, Deming's emphasis on this predictive element derives in part from the work of C.I. Lewis in Mind and the World Order, where Lewis argues that all empirical knowledge is predictive. Even the claim, even the claim that my watch is on the table, I'd better put it there, right? Even the claim that my watch is on the table is predictive. Right? It involves a claim that what is on the table is a certain sort of thing and not another sort of thing. Right? If I look away for a moment and find that when I turn back, right, what I have is a rabbit on the table, right, then I'd best retract the statement I started with. Right? Something has gone awry. Right? To say it's a watch is to say something about the way it will behave in the future. See? And if it doesn't behave in that way, this will show that my original statement was in some way mistaken. Now, Lewis's point in talking about empirical knowledge as predictive is connected with a variety of problems surrounding perception, right, of the material world and of reality as a whole. Essentially, he's saying this: description is prediction. To describe what you perceive is to predict what you will perceive in 10 minutes, or a half hour, or 2 days. On the other hand, as again you may have heard Dr. Deming say, empirical knowledge is only probable. Now, what does this mean? We need to take a look at these two ideas, actually. This idea that empirical knowledge is predictive, right? And the idea that empirical knowledge is probable only, because they in turn suggest a third point that I think is of great importance. This, right? Two ideas I start from: empirical knowledge is predictive, empirical knowledge is probable only, and a consequence. Right? The predictive element in our empirical knowledge is probable only. Now, I think I have seen people notice one of these ideas and notice the other, but not notice this consequence. Right? Empirical knowledge is predictive, yes, but it's also probable. So the predictive element in your empirical knowledge is itself probable. Right? And I'm going to make a good deal of that as we go along. Right? Now, let's take a minute, though, first with this idea of empirical knowledge is probable. Right? Is there some knowledge that is not probable? Right? The contrast, I think, may help us. A philosopher such as C.I. Lewis would say, yes, there is a great deal of knowledge that is not probable, and he would probably call that knowledge a priori. Right? Now, essentially, a priori knowledge is a sort of knowledge concerning what philosophers call necessary truths. Right? And when they say necessary truths, they mean truths that in some way cannot become false. Right? And what's curious about that is, if nowhere in our experience these truths can become false, then whence did we derive them? In other words, you see, if your experience can't show that these truths are at any time mistaken, did you actually learn these truths from experience? And many philosophers puzzling over this have thought, no, that it can't be that way. And that's the sense of a priori, from before. In some sense, from before your experience. Now, not necessarily in time. The idea is simply there are certain sorts of truths, right, that you don't derive from your experience because you couldn't falsify them in your experience. Right? They must have some other source. Right? And different people have tried to work out different answers as to what that source is: the structure of the human mind, previous existence in some other form, all sorts of possibilities are thrown in. Right? All right, give you an example. One would be a triangle is a three-sided figure. Right? Now, if you want to fool around with the meanings of terms, of course, you can mean something else. Right? But understood as it commonly is, your experience will not lead to the falsification of that statement. Now, perhaps you say, oh, but that's just a definition. Right? Another one you might consider: every event has a cause. Now, you have to consider two things here. First, what would it be like if you gave that up? Maybe not every event does have a cause. Right? Well, the trouble with that is, I don't know how you'd ever determine that this or that event did have a cause. It looks as though anything could happen, no causes. Right? On the other hand, you didn't learn that every event has a cause as a result of your experience, because you don't have experience of every event. Right? So how'd you get to that sort of universal statement that in a certain sense you can't give up? Your world falls apart, right? If you give this up. And yet the world, in some sense, couldn't have taught you that every event has a cause. Right? That's the sort of thing that a philosopher would treat as, in some sense, a priori. Right? On the other hand, planets move in elliptical orbits. Empirical. Right? It's conceivable that it should be otherwise. Right? This is not a necessary truth. We learn it through experience, observation, right? And for all we know, it could be falsified tomorrow, right? Present some problems for the laws of physics. So much the worse for the laws of physics, right? All right. Now, the way I want to put this contrast then, I want to say empirical knowledge concerns contingent realities. That is, it concerns objects and states of affairs that happen to be as they are, but could be different. Right? If an empirical statement is true, the watch is on the table, it just happens to be true. That's what I mean by a contingent statement. Right? It may well be false in 2 minutes or 10 minutes. Right? Not so with a priori truths. Right? They are, in some sense, necessarily true. Now, having said that, I have to admit that everything I did say in the last 3 minutes or so is philosophically controversial. Okay? I suppose that goes without saying, right? But if we are to understand what it means to say that empirical knowledge is probable only, right, we do need some distinction between the a priori and the empirical. The a priori is in some sense eternally true. Empirical knowledge is knowledge of contingent matters. Right? So, we cannot have about empirical matters the same sort of certainty we have regarding a priori matters. Right? And this is the point of a philosopher saying empirical knowledge is probable only. Right? And at the level of practice, right, at the practical level, what this means is that in the world of concrete particulars, there can be no unqualified expectations about the future. Our descriptions of the observable world warrant only expectations qualified by our awareness of the probable nature of our empirical knowledge. And my question is, do we recognize this philosophical truth? That descriptions of the observable world warrant only expectations that are qualified by our awareness of the probable nature of our empirical knowledge. Okay? So do we acknowledge the probable nature of our empirical knowledge when, for example, we hold individuals accountable for the various tasks assigned to them? Especially when those tasks are, for example, dependent not only upon available empirical knowledge, but also the sort of extrapolations from that empirical and so probable knowledge that we find in economic forecasts and the like. Right? And on the other hand, if we don't consider all of this, if we don't see our empirical knowledge as probable, okay, then to what extent do we hold individuals responsible for predicting and controlling the future in ways they could not possibly do? Because, of course, that, it seems to me, is a recipe for fear, anxiety, frustration, and alienation. Now, it's at this point that we need to connect, then, the abstractions of the theory of knowledge and the particulars of your day-to-day work. If we have some understanding of what's meant by the statement empirical knowledge is predictive, and some understanding of empirical knowledge is probable only, right? Then we can put these together and conclude the predictive element in our empirical knowledge is itself probable only, right? And I'm asking, does this philosophical truth shape your practice? That is to say, are your practical expectations of the future consistent with an adequate understanding of the nature of empirical knowledge? Right? And if not, what are the consequences of that inconsistency or that inadequacy in your own assumptions? Right? All right, so this is the sort of question I want to explore, and I want to do that by considering with you several different problems. And I want to ask what we could reasonably expect of ourselves if we were to set out to solve these problems. Okay? And what I think we'll see is that problems are not all just problems, okay? Any more than, say, games are all just games. Okay? You can no more solve all problems in the same fashion than you can win all games in the same fashion. Okay? I think this is important because in turn it will suggest that there are different kinds of knowledge required for the different kinds of problems that we face. Okay? And finally, we'll come full circle, and I think the different kinds of knowledge we need to address the different kinds of problems, right, will show us something about what we can reasonably expect when we go out to solve those problems. All right. Now, so let me begin with a problem, right? It's simply this. Construct a square, right, whose area is double that of a given square, right? Here's the solution, right? Use the diagonal of the original square, right? Easy. Now, here I want to say, never mind how I know that this works. Never mind how I know why it works. Right? Just do it. Okay? For it will work. And it will work every time. Right? So, let's notice some things about this problem. Right? First, with this problem, the solution can be passed on to you. I just did. Right? I just passed the solution on to you. And you can apply the solution without ever having to make the intellectual effort that led to the discovery of the solution. Right? You don't need to be troubled with that. Right? In other words, the solution is accessible to anyone who can carry out the technique described. Right? And what we'll see is this cannot be said of every sort of problem. And in this way, we actually have a means of distinguishing kinds of problems. That's important. If we don't see the problems are very different in character, then we're likely to bring to all problems the same sorts of expectations regarding their solutions. Right? And that's my concern. But to identify problems as different in character, we need, I think, a bit of vocabulary. Right? Without, and I'll be repeating this, without an adequate vocabulary, we can't clearly mark or effectively discuss differences. Right? And in this case, differences between kinds of problems. So I'm going to borrow from the late British economist E.F. Schumacher and distinguish between what I'm going to call convergent and divergent problems. Right? Now, roughly, I'm going to say convergent problems are problems whose solution can be reduced to a rule or a recipe. Right? Or perhaps better, convergent problems are problems permitting of a solution that can be written down or somehow passed on to others who can then apply the solution without reproducing the intellectual effort by which the solution was initially devised. Right? And there's my example, doubling the area of the square. And at its simplest, I'd say divergent problems are those problems permitting of no such rote solution. Right? And what I think we'll see as we go on is that the solution, if we want to talk about solutions, of these divergent problems will require a kind of balancing of opposites, right? Such opposites as freedom and obedience, discipline and spontaneity, order and creativity, right? So I'll come back to each of these as we go along, right? Now, so first, we have this contrast between the divergent and the convergent. The second point I'd like to notice about this problem with the square is that it's an abstract problem, right? It's a problem in geometry. So it's a problem belonging to what philosophers would call the realm of the a priori. Right? The knowledge to be used in solving the problem is not empirical. It's not probable. Right? It's necessary, eternal. Right? It's a priori. And from this there follows a third point, namely that I can predict with absolute certainty that if you do follow this technique, you will correctly solve the problem every time. Okay? Now, for that reason, I'm going to take this problem, I'm going to call it problem A, and I'm going to set it over here on the left-hand side of a continuum of problems that we're going to work our way through. Here is A, right? This is my problem of geometry. Okay? And set that up for contrast as we go along. Right? If you just do what you're told, you'll get the solution. Right? We are working in the timeless, the eternal, right? The utterly predictable world of the a priori. Right? So let's consider another problem. Determine the speed on impact of a body falling to the earth from a position of rest at a height of 40 feet. Yeah. That's going to be problem B, all right? What we want to understand is, why am I edging over to the right? All right, there's the problem, and here's the solution, right? Measure the time of the fall and multiply it by 32 feet per second per second. Don't be fooled. I know nothing about this stuff, physics, right? It sounds all right, but don't ask me any questions, all right? That's what they tell me, right? Although I guess you can apply the rule as long as there's not much wind, right? But, of course, the point is, under controlled circumstances, you can apply this solution without reproducing the intellectual effort of Galileo, right, who devised the rule. Right? And in this respect, problem B is like problem A. Right? And that's why I call it convergent. Unlike problem A, however, this problem and its solution don't allow us quite the same sort of confidence, right, in predicting that you will get the correct result. And this is connected with the second point I made about problem A. You see, I said problem A is an abstract problem. Right? This is not. Right? You have a particular object, and we want to know what its impact is going to be when it hits the ground. Right? This is a problem in the contingent material world. Right? And insofar as it's a problem in the contingent material world, knowledge of an abstract formula will not be enough, right? Unlike the geometry. No, that isn't going to be enough. Right? You'll need to know something about the scope of the law or the formula. Right? That is, you'll need to know something about the conditions that qualify your application of the formula. Right? And whether those conditions obtain at this moment, right, in this particular case. Right? It's still not necessary for you to reproduce Galileo's intellectual effort. Right? You can apply the rule, right? But you do have to know the scope of the rule. Right? Now, I have to say, even a lot of that could probably be reduced to a further set of rules and recipes, whatever. Right? But the list of rules governing the application of this rule, right, could never be complete. Right? Why? Well, because our knowledge of the empirical world is probable only. Right? There is no certainty that the material world will conform to our expectations, or to put it differently, that it will conform to its own past habits. After all, even our scientific theories about the empirical world are probable. Right? They've only been confirmed by what happened in the past. And there's no guarantee, again, that the future will conform to the past. Here, then, is one of the limitations of empirical knowledge. It's not possible for us to anticipate all of the contingencies of the world. That's part of what I mean by calling them the contingencies of the world. And yet, if we can't anticipate all of the contingencies of the world, this means we cannot anticipate all of the contingencies that might bear on the application of this rule or that law or this recipe or that technique. Right? And in fact, it's at this point that we begin to see what I'm going to speak of as the limit of technique. The limit of any law or rule or recipe as a problem-solving device. This limit of technique is set, I think, in part, or firstly, by the fact that the world in which we live is a contingent world. Or to put it differently, the limit is set by the fact of novelty in human life. Unless you imagine our world to be entirely predictable, and if you do, I'd suggest you're imagining an abstraction, then we have to accept there will always be room for novelty. Novelty which, because it derives in part from the play of chance in the world, cannot be foreseen, and so cannot be anticipated by the rules, or the rules for applying the rules, or the rules for applying the rules for applying the rules. Our knowledge of the empirical world is probable only. So the predictive element in our knowledge of the empirical world is probable only. All right, so I'm going to set this problem a bit to the right. I'd say it's still convergent in the sense that I can give you the rule, you can apply it, but things are getting a little messier. Right? All right, here's a third problem, even messier. Bake 2 loaves of bread. Right? The solution: follow the recipe in the bread book in my kitchen. Right? Now, the recipe I have in mind here, in my house, we refer to this as the recipe for no-fail white bread. Right? And that's because even I can follow this recipe and produce reasonably edible bread. Right? But again, we have a convergent problem, because I have a recipe I can give you. Right? But again, our knowledge of how to make the bread is empirical knowledge, right? Not a priori knowledge, so our expectations regarding outcomes have to be duly qualified. Right? For instance, if you make this bread in the dead of winter in upstate New York, you won't get quite the same result as when you make this bread in humid, hot Washington, D.C. in July. Right? And even if you consistently make this bread in upstate New York, remember, 1 teaspoon or tablespoon of yeast may not be quite the same as another. Right? This convergent problem, then, is not an abstract problem. It's not a problem in geometry. Right? But neither is it quite the same as our problem of applied physics. Right? In this respect, it's not merely a problem of knowing. Right? It's a problem of making, of producing. Right? It's a problem of production. Right? We're not concerned only to know what has happened or will happen. Right? We want to make something happen. So we'll need the recipe. Right? And that's like the problem in geometry. And we'll need to recognize as best we can the contingencies that might affect, right, the production of this, or the following of the recipe. Right? But we also now have to actually try to control the contingencies of the world around us. Right? If we cannot control, say, the temperature of the water, then we cannot follow the recipe. But now, this points to a further aspect of this third problem, problem C, I'm going to call it, right? Here we're baking bread. This. In order to get the product, there will have to be a producer. The producer, in fact, will be a major variable in the process. A variable that will introduce a distinctly divergent element, right, into our problem. Right? And I want to try to make clear why the introduction of a producer is the introduction of a divergent element, right, by considering a fourth problem. Right? Lining these up for comparison. Right? Fourth problem. Educate a young woman at the close of the 20th century to be an informed critical thinker. The solution, well, I guess, send her to school. Right? Well, maybe not. Maybe the right school. Which is the right school? Well, the school with the right curriculum. Well, maybe the right curriculum and the right teachers. Who are the right teachers? Well, the right teachers, suppose I say, the right teachers are the ones who, possessing a mastery and a love of their subjects, can, without discouraging her natural capacity, yet channel or constrain that capacity for learning within the discipline of a precise vocabulary and rigorous standards of thought. Simple enough. Okay? Clearly, as a solution, this is very different from multiply the time of the fall by 32 feet per second, right? Or use the diagonal of the original square. We've moved well away from the convergent. Right? We've crossed the line, rough or approximate as it may be, between the predominantly convergent problems that we had in A and B through problem C over here to predominantly divergent problems, right, D. So, what sort of differences do we see as we cross this line? First, the closest I can even get to a rule or a recipe is something along the lines of, say, cultivate discipline and encourage independence. But unless you've given some thought to education and the nature of intellectual excellence, that formula will mean little or nothing to you. In other words, this is not a case where you can apply the solution without having reproduced at least some of the intellectual effort required to find that solution in the first place. On the contrary, unless you've made that kind of effort, you'll simply not understand the solution. Unless you've given considerable thought to the problem, right, how can you even see the problem for what it is? That is, how can you see the true nature of the problem? Or, a little differently, how could you describe the problem? And now, there's a lot of talk about the problem of education. Okay? It's never terribly clear to me what people even mean by that. Okay? Right. But the crucial point here for us is, apart from some ideas about education, I'd say you can't even see the problem here for what it is. Right? Now, I'm going to come back to that, but let's notice something else first about this problem. Let's suppose you do grasp the formula, such as it is, right? Still, its application will be anything but rote. Right? Indeed, to the extent that you try in any sort of rote or unthinking way to cultivate discipline and encourage independence, you'll most certainly fail to cultivate discipline and encourage independence. Okay? So there are important differences between this divergent problem and the more convergent problems we've so far considered, right? First, you can't carry out this solution without reproducing at least some of the intellectual effort that went into discovering the solution in the first place. But then, curiously, that's also to say you won't even correctly identify the problem, right? Adequately describe the problem without some of that intellectual effort, right? And that's why, in turn, I'd say there's no rote application of a solution here, right? Which I think, myself, goes a long way to explaining Dr. Deming's frequent remark, there is no substitute for knowledge. All right, now, I think at this point, though, we're in need of a bit more vocabulary. You'll see some connections here, I think, with what Tom Nolan was saying this morning. I've spoken of the limits of technique. Right? Now, I want to distinguish between art and mere technique. Right? And art, I will define in this way. I'm going to say an art is an acquired ability of making or producing, right, based on knowledge or science. Right? And everything in there makes a difference. Everything in that definition makes a difference. It's always a bit of a surprise to people. I talk about the liberal arts. I teach logic. It's one of the traditional liberal arts. People don't normally think of the liberal arts as modes of production. Right? But that is the sense of art used in that whole tradition. Right? It's just the product is intellectual. It's not material. Right? And to master the art is to be able to produce something, cogent argument, for example, persuasive discourse, there's another liberal art rhetoric, right? To be able to produce it on the basis of knowledge, not luck, right? This ability that is the art, right, is an ability based on knowledge. So I may manage to grow vegetables, but that doesn't guarantee I possess the art of agriculture, right? Another one of the traditional mechanical arts, actually. Right? The vegetables may be the result of luck, or maybe I'm just following someone else's directions. Right? Right. The artful growing of vegetables consists in the production of vegetables, right, through the knowledgeable manipulation of soil, plant, water, whatever. Right? And the product will be a work of art to the extent that I do produce through the knowledge I possess. Right? Now, so as I'm talking of art, art is dependent on science, even if we construe science very broadly, right? Not limiting it to empirical sciences. Right? All right, so what then is the contrast I want between art and technique? A technique is simply a practical element or skill belonging to an art. So to speak of mere technique, as I will speak of mere technique, right, will be to speak of a practice or a skill divorced from the knowledge that could correctly guide or direct the skill. Right? So that with this distinction in mind, right, we can perhaps understand a bit better why I spoke of the limit of technique. Right? Novelty, I suggested before, cannot be eliminated from the human condition. Okay? But only knowledge, I want to say, right, can transform technique into art. Okay? And only art, skill informed by knowledge, could hope to deal with novelty, the novelty that is an inevitable part of our life. Right? So, putting these together, right, saying technique is skill divorced from knowledge, what I'm suggesting is that technique is powerless in the face of novelty. Right? New conditions, right, introducing elements of the unpredictable, technique is dead. Right? but there's no eliminating novelty. Right? So technique must be transformed into art, and again, my suggestion is that transformation consists in the acquisition of knowledge. Right? Again, there is no substitute for knowledge. Right? Now, all right, let's consider a further difference between this divergent problem of education and any convergent problem that we might come up with. Suppose you do reproduce the required thought and do comprehend the solution. Right? If talk of a solution seems to make any sense any longer. Right? Still, you will not be able to predict with any certainty whether you will, in applying the solution, get the correct result, namely an informed critical thinker. Right? Now, there is some similarity here to the case of predicting the body falling. Right? This is prediction in the contingent world. Right? And there's some similarity between, right, I'm saying you can't have absolute certainty about that you'll get the result you want in this problem of education. There's some similarity with the baking of the bread. Right? But the difficulties that come into play here with this problem D, as I call it, right, problem of education, are not explained, right, by the fact, first of all, that we moved from the very abstract to the concrete. Right? No, it's not quite that. Right? It's true you'll need to know. Right, you have moved, this problem of education is a problem in the contingent world. You will need to know, I suppose, the student you're working with. Just as in applying Galileo's law, you need to know something about atmospheric conditions and the like. Right? But new complications enter simply because the student you're dealing with is a human being, right? Not an inert object. Right? Not even some merely animate object such as a dog or a duck. Right? The difference, I would suggest, is that with the human being, you have a being with a will of her own. And if I dare say it, a free will. Right? And the difference that makes is enormous. Right? And we have to try to understand why that difference is so enormous. Right? Now, the problem of education is a problem of wanting to make something happen with or through the agency, the work, of a free human being. Right? We want to ensure that in other circumstances, we want to ensure that a free human being produces a given product, whether it's bread or film or fuel injectors. Right? Or in other cases, we may want to ensure that a free human being masters a certain academic subject, right? They have different sorts of cases here. Right? And so becomes an educated human being. We want to make sure. Right? But of course, to compel a human being is to take away that human being's freedom. At the least, it's to resist that freedom or to try to limit it. But if it is of the nature of a human being, as distinct from a tree or a tulip or a tiger, to be free, then our action will in some sense run counter to the nature of that being. Indeed, we will find ourselves treating that human being as though he or she were not quite a human being. And that, it seems to me, it's likely enough that to treat something as though it were something it is not will lead to trouble. Right? I'd say right here, countless issues surrounding pride of workmanship come into play. Right? On the other hand, not to compel this worker or this student is to risk failure. Right? No product comes off an assembly line because workers simply do as they please. Right? So how are we to address this conflict? There is a risk of failure whether we try to compel or refrain from compelling. Right? Now, here's what I suggested earlier with divergent problems. Solutions, again, I'm sort of hedging my bets, if it makes sense to talk of solutions any longer, will take the form of the balancing of opposites. freedom and obedience, discipline and spontaneity. Right? And indeed, this, I think, is the distinctive element of a divergent problem. But what I'm now suggesting is that any problem that requires the cooperative effort of human beings is, by that very fact, a divergent problem. Okay? Which means, in effect, I think that any problem of production or management will be a divergent problem. Okay, well, let's regroup a bit. Right? See, we've got at one end of our continuum of problems, we've got a convergent problem in the realm of the a priori, problem of geometry. And these problems require of us a certain sort of knowledge, what I've called a priori knowledge. Right? And some of this will, in fact, be valuable as we move over into the empirical realm. Right? A priori knowledge of geometry can help a farmer lay out his fields. Our word geometry comes from the Greeks looking at the Egyptians measuring the earth. Right? But if we do try to lay out fields for planting using our geometry, right, we'll also need some other sort of knowledge, namely what I'm calling empirical knowledge. Right? For this is an empirical problem, a problem, right, how to lay out these fields, a problem in the observable material world. A world of contingencies, of states of affairs that happen to be as they are but could be otherwise. Right? Now, if we're clear about what we are doing when we grapple with convergent problems in the empirical realm, then we will have to remember that our empirical knowledge is probable only. It lacks the certainty of a priori knowledge. Outside of the most controlled circumstances, we'll need more than a mechanical application of a predetermined solution. We will need what I'm calling art. Right? But when we pass over to the more completely divergent problems, right, through problems of production to problem of education, right, another change occurs. And the change is suggested by the very character of the rule or the recipe, right, we might try to apply in the face of these problems. Again, take the case of education. What's the rule? Cultivate discipline while encouraging independence of thought, independence. The rule tells us itself to balance opposites. Right? But again, now notice something we've already touched on. While the formula or the rule calls for a balancing of opposites, isn't the formula, which is in a sense the solution, also a statement of the problem? Right? This is why I think, as I suggested, with divergent problems you cannot apply the solution without having reproduced the intellectual effort, the thought and the understanding that initially led to the statement of the solution. Right? You can only attempt the solution if you recognize the nature of the problem. That is, if you correctly describe the dilemma you face. And the intellectual effort required to do that will be the effort that also shows you at least the form of the solution. All right, take again the problem of education. Right? I wondered before, what is the problem of education? Here's a suggestion, that it is the problem expressed in this solution. Right? A solution taken from the philosopher John Locke, writing in the 17th century, who said this. Here's the problem, that is the solution. To avoid the danger that is on either hand is the great art. And he that has found a way to keep up a child's spirit, easy, active, and free, and yet at the same time, to restrain him from many things he has a mind to, and to draw him to things that are uneasy to him. He, I say, that knows how to reconcile these seeming contradictions has, in my opinion, got the true secret of education. Okay? Now, see, my point is, while that's a description of the solution, it is a description of the problem. And if you haven't given a certain kind of thought to education, to what knowledge is, to what understanding is, right, then I don't think you're going to recognize the problem or the solution, because in an important sense, they are the same thing. Right? So, Locke, it seems to me, illustrates well the point that the correct identification of a divergent problem, right, is also a description of the solution to the problem. And that both of these, identification of problem and of solution, require a certain intellectual effort that is not necessary in the application of solutions to convergent problems. Right? But, as I've already hinted, right, I do wonder if this is the way to set up the contrast that I'm working at here. Right? Would it be more correct to say the intellectual effort that enables you to recognize the nature of the problem you face, right, the effort that enables you to see you have a divergent problem here, will also show you that here, there just isn't anything that is rightly called a solution. Right? See, if we understand the true nature of divergent problems, do we not also understand that the concept of a solution has very little place here? Right? These problems, I want to say, are not solved. Now remember, I've already suggested that the fundamental problems of management and production are divergent problems. So I'm suggesting that the fundamental problems of management are problems that are not solved. Right? They are addressed, perhaps, or attacked, right? Or perhaps they are simply lived. But to talk of a solution, I think maybe to go off in the wrong direction altogether. Right? Now, this, of course, can seem a very discouraging possibility. Interventions in the contingent world should be shaped by our empirical knowledge of that world. Right? And while there is a predictive element in all empirical knowledge, right, that knowledge is nonetheless probable. This much is true even in the case of convergent problems. But the predictive element in our empirical knowledge is more severely limited as soon as we enter the realm of the divergent, the realm of problems that are not so much solved, I want to say, as they are lived. Right? And in this point, again, I want to go back to Schumacher. So follow with me, if you will, a somewhat lengthy quotation from Ernst Schumacher. The true problems of living, he writes, in politics, economics, education, marriage, right, are always problems of overcoming or reconciling opposites. They are divergent problems and have no solution in the ordinary sense of the word. They demand of man not merely the employment of his reasoning powers, but the commitment of his whole personality. Naturally, spurious solutions by way of a clever formula are always being put forward. But they never work for long because they invariably neglect, right, one of the two opposites and thus lose the very quality of human life. In economics, the solution offered may provide for freedom but not for planning, or vice versa. In industrial organization, it may provide for discipline but not for workers' participation in management. In politics, it might provide for leadership without democracy, or again, right, for democracy without leadership. Problems, then, right, are not simply problems. They differ in their nature, and so in the kind of response they demand of us. In fact, it seems to me the great practical lesson to be learned from the mere recognition that the problems we face are not all of the same kind, the great practical lesson to be learned from that recognition is this: the failure to see differences in the nature of the problems we face encourages wildly inappropriate expectations as to our ability and our responsibility to solve them. If we view the world as just so many convergent problems, right? Just so many convergent problems, then it seems we must exaggerate the predictive element in our knowledge of that world. Or we must, in turn, deny the role of human beings as free agents in that world. And in either case, it seems to me we're headed for trouble. Because, again, these inappropriate expectations will be experienced in the form of what I call an erroneous sense of responsibility. I ought to be able to solve this problem. Right? The inappropriate expectations then lead to what I'm calling an erroneous sense of responsibility, and, on the other hand, debilitating notions of accountability. He or she holds me accountable for the solution of this problem. Right? It seems to me that these ideas and these feelings, right, are all but certain to encourage the wasteful and perfectly hopeless application of convergent solutions to divergent problems. Right? In fact, I venture to say that this mistake, the application of convergent solutions to divergent problems, may be one of the largest, or if not the largest, unrecognized cost in the practice of American business, industry, and increasingly education. I mean, you choose your own examples. I mean, numerical ranking of workers. I experienced various forms of evaluation, techniques of evaluating teaching. The fundamental point, under what I would call the triple burden of erroneous sense of responsibility, debilitating notions of accountability, and finally, an inadequate vocabulary of problems, right? An inability to identify differences. Right? How can we help but take refuge in convergent solutions? What else could we do? Right? Take refuge in formulae, rules, recipes. How could we expect ourselves and others to acknowledge the reality of divergent problems, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and the limits of our control over the future? Given this sense of responsibility, this sense of accountability, how can we expect ourselves and others to recognize what I've called the limits of technique? Now, I have tried to suggest here why why we are tempted to treat divergent problems as though they were convergent. We live in a culture that places a high value on efficiency. Right? This alone is enough to make divergent problems especially discouraging to us. And in the face of that discouragement, we are tempted to treat the divergent as though they were convergent, and so to devise some inappropriate convergent solutions. It does seem to me, though, that we do well to recognize how thoroughly impractical this is. It's impractical, again, because it's wasteful. Resources will be used in applying these convergent solutions to divergent problems, right? When we could have known beforehand that solution and problem passed one another by. Worse, I mean to suggest, right, the application of these convergent solutions to divergent problems will be quite destructive. Again, people will be held accountable for effecting solutions when we could have known beforehand the solution was inappropriate to the problem. And finally, the results of that, in turn, can only be unhappy. Right? Eventually, I think, and my guess is that you have all had some experience of this, right? Convergent solutions thrown at divergent problems will be met by either cynicism or enthusiasm, and both are understandable. Right? The enthusiasm will be felt by those who in their inexperience, or, pardon me, but perhaps invincible ignorance, right, welcome a solution. Right? But after sufficient failure, even the enthusiasm will turn to cynicism. Right? Which to me it seems is clearly the road to fear, discouragement, and alienation. Right? Also, it seems to me a recipe for what I've called, and I don't think I came up with this, I must have heard someone, right? Flavor of the month management. Right? All right, now, what then is to be done? Right? This is discouraging. We seem to face a dilemma. See, the failure to see the limits of technique, the failure to see that problems requiring the cooperative efforts of human beings are necessarily divergent in nature, that's a failure that is likely to lead to discouragement. As I'm saying, people will become frustrated and discouraged because they're throwing these convergent solutions at divergent problems. On the other hand, if you acknowledge what I've called the limits of technique, in a culture impatient with complexity and anxious for efficiency, that may itself be very discouraging. No one wants to hear there are problems that cannot be solved. So, my question now is, are we left with no choice but discouragement or discouragement? Right? But I have to go, so you'll answer that. I make my break for the door at this point. Right. Well, no, I don't think, I wouldn't have the nerve to stand up here if I thought those were the only choices, would I? Right? No, I don't think that's all we're left with, discouragement or discouragement. But to begin with, I mean, to say, before I go very far, it is, I think, worth reflecting on the fact that a world without divergent problems, difficult as they are, a world without divergent problems simply is not a world in which there are human beings. Right? So it doesn't seem to me to be a world in which you'll find human beings living, flourishing, and finding any kind of satisfaction. In fact, it seems to me a nightmare. So we have to be careful when we wish those divergent problems would go away. What are we wishing for? At the same time, in the face of whatever discouragement we do understandably feel, surely the only hope worth having is a hope built on some foundation of knowledge of our real situation, knowledge of the real possibilities for change, knowledge of the real means available to us for change. Now, there is a long philosophical tradition espousing such knowledge, such practical wisdom. In this tradition, this practical wisdom, this wisdom about what can and should be done in this particular circumstance or that particular circumstance, right? This wisdom is known as prudence. And while the learning of prudence is almost certainly a discouraging and painful thing, it's also, or so I mean to suggest, right, a learning that provides the only solid foundation for hope in the future, for hope in the face of the problems that do beset us. Right? It's here, I want to say, it's here that one can see how any individual who took up a further study of the theory of knowledge or of other related branches of philosophy, I think, might provide business, industry, government, healthcare, education, a great service. Okay? Because it seems to me such individuals could provide the means to recognize and understand the real nature of the problems we face, which are very different in their nature. right? To master a vocabulary of differences. That's how I like to talk of it, a vocabulary of differences. Right? To be able to see and explain to others, right, that problems are not all just problems, that they differ in kind, and so they require for their solution different kinds of solutions. In fact, solutions so different we may not even want to call them solutions. Right? To be able to provide that for others in business, industry, healthcare, government, this, it seems to me, would be a great service and a cause for hope. Right? I mean, the hope that waste could be reduced, that misplaced accountability and an erroneous sense of responsibility could be seen for what they are. Causes of fear, discouragement, and cynicism. In fact, on the basis of that sort of understanding, we might even hope, this is a rather ambitious one, I suppose, that the different kinds of knowledge required by business, industry, government, hospitals, right, the different kinds of knowledge, right, might all be pursued with equal vigor. Right? Something which I think clearly is not the case today. Right? Now, I suggested earlier that without an adequate vocabulary, we could not clearly mark or effectively discuss differences between the kinds of problems we face in our daily work. And I've tried to suggest why it's important to be able to discuss differences of this kind. Right? If we had no understanding of the distinction between convergent problems and divergent problems, we might not even know that we needed different sorts of knowledge. Right? A kind of practical wisdom in order to deal with many of the problems we face, the divergent problems. Right? At least we'd not be in a position to speak to one another about the differences between these kinds of problems. And so we might find ourselves consistently throwing convergent solutions at divergent problems and devoting all or nearly all of our resources to the acquisition and development of the sort of knowledge we need to address convergent problems. Neglecting, right, I'd say at our peril, neglecting this equally or even more important practical wisdom, the prudence that I would suggest is cultivated, of course, by experience, through experience, but also through the study of history, literature, philosophy. Right? And in fact, am I not describing the situation in which we do find ourselves? Right? Situation in which we are not applying equal resources to the different kinds of knowledge we need for the different kinds of problems we confront. Right? We treat divergent problems as though they were convergent, and we neglect, I think, again, to our peril, the acquisition of practical wisdom. And then, of course, we are discouraged when our solutions are ineffective. Right? And my suggestion is, of course, that all of this sounds to me very impractical. All right, now, let me just ask you to notice something, though, that may have happened here. Right? And I'll close with this. I attempted, in a somewhat roundabout fashion, a kind of introduction to the theory of knowledge. I tried to suggest to you some of the questions, some of the vocabulary, and a kind of application of some of what counts as the theory of knowledge. Right? An introduction by which we came to see that the problems we face in our daily work are very different in kind, and so require of us different kinds of knowledge, right, if they're to be effectively addressed. But it seems to me that even this has already given us a bit of that practical wisdom we need in order to deal with divergent problems. Surely it is a part of a very practical wisdom to recognize that it is unwise to throw convergent solutions at divergent problems, so that perhaps we are a bit wiser, a bit more prudent than we were an hour ago, which would be a fine result, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's almost difficult. I can't say anything. Phew. Is there anybody that has a burning question they would like to ask? I just hate to lose the opportunity. Go ahead.
John, Dr. Deming devoted an entire chapter in Out of the Crisis to the idea of regulation and standards, and said basically that regulation is good if it is better than the waste that it causes. Have you had a chance to think through the idea of law and compulsion? Could you kind of put that on your continuum of divergent, convergent solutions?
Right. If I understand, the question concerns the use of regulation.
What is that appropriate?
Right.
How does that all fit?
Right. Yeah. Initially, two things strike me. Of course, insofar as we're dealing with more convergent problems and devising techniques for solving them, right? Various forms of regulation, it seems to me, would make perfect sense and be applicable without much to do, right? And of course, my point is the further you move toward the divergent, the less applicable that sort of thinking, that sort of approach to a problem will be. But the other thing that I think might be worth noticing, I mean, there are certain kinds of regulation that amount to a sort of discipline that we probably need, right? And they needn't be, this needn't be unthinking rote application of technique. It may just be, it just goes with cooperative work, right? And I take it this is where something like operational definitions profitably come into play. Let's make sure we're on the same page and understanding the same things by the terms we're using, the process, whatever it may be, right? So I don't think, if I'm understanding what you mean by regulation, I don't think the value of that is limited to convergent problems. Maybe we have to think about it a little differently. We may have to think about it more in terms of a common discipline that we are subjecting ourselves to so as to work cooperatively as free-thinking human beings, right, toward a common end. Is that helpful? Am I answering?
Well, it just bothered me in terms of the idea of compulsion. You know, the difference between a regulation and a standard is the one is compulsory, where the other one is voluntary, and the whole world of law is compelling.
Right. It's not by chance that I described that second use of regulation the way I did, right? As a common standard we all subject ourselves to, a discipline we subject ourselves to with a view to some common aim or common end. And I mean, just to make one application of that idea, it seems to me that is a great deal of what education is about. That's what Locke is trying to say. How can you inspire, right, or move individuals to subject themselves to discipline? How can they want? How can you help them move to a point at which they want the painful discipline that you are ready to, in some sense, impose upon them? But the imposition never quite gets you what you want. It's the willing subjection that gets you, I think, real education. Right? And that's the art that Locke is talking about. So that application may help, I think. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I've got a slight problem here, and that is that we're running 5 minutes into a short exercise we wanted to do. David, would you like to throw a quick question out, and then we'll move on from there? You'll be around for the rest of the conference.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry. Shall I go ahead?
Go ahead, yes. And then we'll stop there.
I just wanted to add a comment that to relate this to one of the things that Dr. Deming used to say, and that is he used to say the questions are more important than the answers. And one year we had a research weekend, and we made this the theme of the research weekend. We got him at wait to the end and tell us why the questions are more important than the answers. This was the answer he gave, that there's seldom one right answer. There's a whole range of reasonably possible things to choose between, but there's usually one question you ought to be asking. So I think that's very closely integrated with what you're saying. There's never one right answer. Well, not often one right answer, but there is a question you ought to ask. And that's not always obvious.
Okay, thank you, David. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
What we'd like to ask you to do, we have about 8 or 9 minutes before lunch, and we'd like to ask you to make, if you could, just one small but I guess giant leap toward another intellectual effort here. In the back of both Tom Nolan's material and Dr. Edelman's material is a set of questions that both men have provided for you to take an opportunity now to sit back and reflect on. You might want to read through them. Actually, Tom's is a separate sheet, and John's is literally on the back of the last page of his material. If you could, read through the questions, choose one set or the other, or one question from any one of the two sets, and just think, maybe take some notes in order to integrate, if you can, some of what you've heard this morning. Each other speaker, where appropriate, has that same set of questions, and we won't be taking any time formally other than now for this process, but perhaps if you get the hang of it here in the next 9 or 10 minutes, then it will be easier to do as the day goes on and into tomorrow. At 12:15 there or thereabouts, I'll give a yell and give you the instructions for lunch.